Welcome to Center for Chinese Study Elvira Kwang Sim Lim Memorial Lecture in Chinese Studies. My name is Youtian Xing. I'm the faculty in geography, and I'm also the chair for Center for Chinese Studies here at Berkeley. This endowed chair lecture was made possible through the very generous gift to the Center for Chinese Studies by Mrs. Lim's family. This year, we are very honored to have Professor Vivian Xu to deliver our Lim Memorial Lecture. Vivian Xu is a professor emeritus of contemporary China studies at the University of Oxford. She's also a fellow of St. Antony's College and fellow of the British Academy. Before she joined Oxford in 2002 as the director of its Contemporary China Study program, Vivian also taught Chinese politics at Yale and Cornell universities for more than 25 years. Her teaching and writing on the Chinese state and society has influenced generations of scholars. Many of you are here, and many of you are not here. But I promised Vivian I'll give a very short introduction, since she really doesn't need more introduction. And she has this very influential classic book on the reach of the state, which is still on the must-read list that I give to my students. And also other classic works, Dear Government and Economy in Chinese County. And her recent works include some of the well-cited book chapters, such as Legitimacy, Crisis in China, ? And Mao's China, Putting Politics in Perspective. For today's talk, Vivian will present her current research that examines 21st century Chinese government modes and techniques, including high-tech national development planning, using big data and satellite mapping. This work will be published very soon from Cambridge University Press in a co-edited volume with Patricia Thornton entitled To Govern China, Involving Practices of Power. Please join me in welcoming Professor Vivian Xu.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Youtian, for your kind introduction. And I'd like to thank everyone at the Center for Chinese Studies, faculty and staff who were involved in inviting me to participate in what has become such a distinguished lecture series and giving me the opportunity to come back here to Berkeley, which for me, as for so many of us, has been for so long now such a consequential space in Chinese studies where serious work gets done. It's always a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for turning out. I'm glad to see you all. I have an awful lot I want to try to tell you about today, and we're going to start out as you can. I want to warn you very much on dry land, but we're going to end up at least ankle deep in water. And still all the while, of course, we will be thinking about how to think about power and how to think about political change in China. Since time is short, I don't want to spend too much of it on preliminaries. Nevertheless, to help keep you all with me on what I fear is going to be a bit of a meander, I thought it might help to first explain something about myself, which I don't normally tell people about. But all my life, I've been one of those poor, lost souls who's cursed with a truly inferior sense of direction. You may have run across other people like me. We're never entirely sure where the place we are is in relationship to, say, other places. And we're never quite sure how we got to where we are, or how we might go about retracing our steps, or which way to turn to get to our next destination. And so we do tend to follow indirect routes at times, and something like a meander. This you can learn to conceal pretty well and manage to seem pretty well pulled together. But persistent locational uncertainty can cause stress. And I can tell you that I've only found about 3 different coping mechanisms for this in my life. We can talk about the other 2 later in the Q&A if you're interested. But the one I want to draw your attention to is that it's a very good idea if you're afflicted in this way to develop a serious affection and admiration for maps. And I have been interested in maps of all kinds all of my life. I have, as you might imagine, pored for countless hours over maps of China in particular. And so I have to conclude that this is the real reason why, when in 2011, when I first saw these maps, which no other China watchers that I was aware of seemed to be giving very much attention to, I was so transfixed by them, and I've been working on them ever since. The maps in question that we're going to be looking at briefly, very briefly, sorry to say today, were released at the very end of 2010 with something that was called, when the State Council promulgated something that was called China's first ever National Spatial Master Plan. And it was rolled out at that time as part of the planning that came along with the introduction of the 12th Five-Year Plan. The National Spatial Master Plan was a plan intended to govern the development and use of the whole of the national territory, all of its land, all of its waters. And I was just startled by the immensity of its objectives and the sheer ambition of it, as well as by the maps. The master plan stipulated that all of China's land and all its waters would be classified into categories according to the main function each area was deemed to perform. And these categorical zoning assignments would determine the speed and the extent to which, and the guidelines according to which each zoned space and any of the resources within it could or could not be utilized for future development. The basic framework upon which the master plan rested posited just 3 types of principal functions: urban industrial, rural agricultural, and ecological functions, which were conceived of as the generation of essential ecological products, such as clean water, fresh air, and sufficient biodiversity to sustain a tolerable climate and environment for human life to survive and to flourish. Let's see if we can get right. This is a slide from a PowerPoint that was used by Vice Minister Yang Weimin when he was introducing the plan at a meeting that I attended. The National Zoning Plan, as you can see, this is, even if you can't read the blurry Chinese, I really wanted you to see the photographs which show how things used to be and how they are now. It was premised, this plan, on a rather sober assessment of China's existing pattern of spatial development as one that was already, by that time, dangerously out of balance. The nation's natural geographic endowment, it has, as you know, vast stretches of mountainous terrain and arid deserts and high-altitude plateau. This confronts the still growing population with a severe shortage of space suitable still for development. What space remains has already been compromised by sprawling urban growth, destruction of farmland, and uncontrolled exploitation of natural resources over recent decades, as well as by numerous misguided earlier attempts at development that proved very damaging. So on this rather ominous general assessment made by the National Development and Reform Commission, the NDRC Central Planners, the challenges to development that the nation faced were posed essentially as spatial ones. Once the principal function of a zone was set, it could be further categorized into one of just 4 spatial development groupings. And here we have a map that shows us the key urbanized areas. The first zone, I'll go through these rather quickly, was where future development would continue, but it would have to be optimized. This was, let's see if we have a pointer, yeah. This referred to the major already rapidly booming areas that were macroeconomies along the coast, which were planned to continue to urbanize, to grow rapidly, but which had to be made to develop more space intensively by optimizing consumption of land, energy, and resources using high efficiency technologies. Right. The second category was the area in which zoning, in which development would be prioritized, not optimized, but prioritized, given priority. And these were areas already possessing comparatively strong capacities for innovation and modernization, and they were primarily in the middle of the central region of the country. As you see, they're demarcated there in those large blue circles. There were then zones, the third category, where development would have to be restricted, and these were broken into two groups in the master plan. First, the zones of the country which would be classified as essentially agricultural. This shows you those belts. First, this is where farming and fisheries and allied technical support and service and food processing and distribution industries were to be concentrated in the future. And the nation's goals here were cast, when you read the plan, rather starkly, again, in terms of taking all steps necessary to assure the nation's food security. Take a look, well, okay, we'll just wait one more slide. The final zone, the second group, rather, of the third zone, was the environmental zones. And this was comprised of several regions of critical importance to the nation's environmental security. In these zones, the goals included permitting only environmentally friendly industrial development and reducing human populations where they have already reached levels that are putting dangerous pressures on natural resources, in part by engineering planned migrations of excess populations out of these regions. Take a look just up here and kind of remember the shape of that as we look at the next slide, and this will give you an idea. This indicates the zones that were in the fourth category, those where which were national level prohibited development zones. And the map demarcates the areas where future development would have to be entirely prohibited. These included vital, already fragile or endangered environments across the national territory. And by 2010, these were already clearly marked out, as you can see, and quite extensive. And they included even the demarcation of, this map shows special places like an existing and planned UNESCO World Heritage Sites, national parks and forests, natural monuments, and scenic treasures. So the planning had gotten quite specific on the map. Now, when I was studying each of these national level maps, I gradually came to understand, that what I was looking at was a map of a plan, mapped targets to be achieved through implementation of a long-term spatial plan. And anyone who possesses even a superficial familiarity with Chinese political realities is aware that central plan target setting as a standard tool of governance is one thing, while implementation or non-implementation of those targets on the ground is usually something else entirely. So it's not surprising that at the same time that these maps were released and the plan was announced, from the outset, much attention was also given to crafting central policies and a whole sets of policies in ways that would incentivize localities, especially those localities where development would have to be restricted or prohibited, incentivizing those places to comply with land use zoning regulations. So there was a complementary constellation, as you see in this slide, borrowed from a colleague at Tsinghua University, of fiscal, investment, sectoral, land, population, environmental, and cadre performance evaluation, and other supporting policies that were rolled out at the same time in a general, yet to be perfected way then. Now, these may look complex, especially if you don't read Chinese, I'm sorry, if you don't. But there was really very little that was subtle about them. One way or another, they were intended to neutralize opposition by buying off local people, local corporations, and not least local officials, with huge injections of central subsidies and transfers, compensatory payments and rewards, preferential investments and tax breaks, buyouts, land swaps, and other managed incentive schemes. So you'll see what ensued. There's little doubt in my mind, trying to follow the implementation of this over the past few years, that massive infusions of cash, billions and billions of US dollars allocated from central budgets, have been what has kept the national zoning program moving forward over this period. One of the program's key promoters, this Vice Minister of Development Planning named Yang Wei-min, likened what are referred to as ecological products, such as clean air and fresh water, to, and this is a quote from him, goods that everyone needs but no one can afford to buy. It's the role and responsibility of government, he argued then, to put enough money on the table, in effect, to purchase these goods for the people and for the nation. Now, as I said, I've pored over many a map of China in my time, but in early 2011, when I first saw these maps, I was hugely impressed with them, and impressed with statements like the one I just quoted from Yang, whose lecture introducing the zoning program to what was a very keyed-up auditorium full of public policy students at Tsinghua, I happened to be able to attend. The change of direction that this master plan represented then, after decades of active state complicity in the despoliation of the Chinese environment, struck me as remarkable, powerful, especially accompanied, as the maps were, by nearly 200 published pages supporting the need for maps like this, with reference to hundreds of high-tech scientific data reports, satellite-enabled GIS observations, and computer projections compiled by blue ribbon panels of botanists, zoologists, geologists, soil scientists, meteorologists, medical researchers, demographers, urban planners, and public policy experts. Yang Wei-min's no-nonsense lecture to the Tsinghua student bureaucrats featured the glossiest, most comprehensive PowerPoint presentation I had ever seen. Mixing, as it did, the stern mentality of state regulation with ecology and systematics-based, climate change and conservation-inflected discourses on sustainability, and featuring also 21st century capitalism's ideals of high-tech generated, digitally empowered, best practice managerialism in business, public safety, and governance. The very creation of these maps was an immense performance of power, I thought. The power of planners at the center to orchestrate state-of-the-art data collection and analysis over vast fields of scientific and social knowledge, and then to synthesize it so as to generate goals on the ground and guide governmental action. In these painstakingly mapped visions, we observe the totality of the Chinese nation space, now imagined as one of comprehensively ordered, thoroughly harmonized, ultra-productive efficiency with ecological sustainability and strict preservation guaranteed, both for China's priceless natural resources and its prized cultural heritage. These maps would have to be regarded as visionary, I thought. No other nation remotely approaching the size of China has attempted to plan the use, literally, of every square kilometer of its nation space. Yet as I got back to Oxford, I began explaining what I was spending my research time on to various students and colleagues back then. I observed that most of them seemed pretty underwhelmed. And so I struggled to analyze in my own mind the powerfulness that I thought I saw in these maps. So you mean only some things on these maps are real? One of my students asked. A lot of what's represented there is just imagined. It's what the planners would like to see happen by, say, 2030 or 2050. Well, given that you, Vivian, of all people, ought to know about the actual chances of getting good things done for people's health and the environment in China these days, he seemed, the student, to want to signal to me, aren't these maps just something the party state does for show? Really? Dreams? Just so much decorative artwork, as it were. I understood the reaction, of course, even half shared it myself, until I finally recalled a passage I'd read years earlier in Hugh Brody's, by then already classic, cultural ethnography of modern-day Canadian subarctic Indian hunter-trappers who still talk about their people's old ways. What Brody's book on the Athapascan Indians, which is titled Maps and Dreams, if you haven't come across it. What that book had revealed, I thought, was that even before there were states, before settled agriculture and civilization, human beings surviving in groups on the land and the waters were making maps out of dreams about the future and associating their maps with power. A mysterious power. Let me read you the passage that I then went back to the book to look up. It relates something one man let slip out one evening in a conversation around the campfire when Brody, the ethnographer, was out with a small band of hunters. This man said, and it's a long quotation, but it's fun. Some old-timers, men who became famous for their powers and skills, had been great dreamers, hunters and dreamers. They had not sought uncertainly for the trails of animals whose movements we can only guess at. No, they located their prey in dreams, found their trails, and made dream kills. Then the next day, they could go out, find the trail, re-encounter the animal, and collect the kill. Maybe you think this is all nonsense, just so much bullshit. Maybe you don't think this power is possible. Few people understand. The Indians around this country know a lot about power. In fact, everyone has had some experience of it. The fact that dream hunting works has been proved many times. Today, it's hard to find men who can dream this way. There are too many problems. Maybe there will again be strong dreamers when these problems we face are overcome. Then more maps will be made, new maps. Oh yes, Indians made maps. You would not take any notice of them. You might say such maps are crazy. Old-timers made maps of trails, ornamented them with lots of fancy, the good people. None of this is easy to understand, but good men, the really good men, could dream of more than animals. Sometimes they saw heaven and its trails. You may laugh at these maps of the trails to heaven, but they were done by the good men who had the heaven dream and who wanted to tell the truth. They worked hard on their truth. Well, looking back at Brody's book, I reminded myself of how the mapping of dreams and visioning the future has long been an indispensable first step in the practice of power, a reflective, creative performance through which leaders of human groups, from hunting and fishing communities to modern-day nation-states, exercise both cognitive and practical influence over the world as it is today and the world to come. To envision the future, to map it, has regularly served as an instrument of leadership, one technique for agenda setting, for striving to move all concerned parties onto the same page, and for pointing the way forward. Now, while some may be inclined to dismiss China's spatial master plan and its maps as just a dream, others may see it as a vision for the future. Among the scientific experts and the technicians and the map makers and the very solemnly resolute senior central planners in Beijing who have been promoting maps like these and the meanings that lie behind them over these recent years, I think it may be more accurate to say that these digitized spatial imaginings are conceived more by them as elegant sketches of what remain long, hard roads ahead. For China's top development planners, these maps represent the tracings of cold and treacherous trails that needs must be trodden by all, and in double quick time, in real fear of ecological collapses, environmental calamities, social disorientations, even nationwide privation. And traversed these trails must be in hungry pursuit instead of an urban, modern, higher tech version of a kind of heaven on earth for the nation and its people. So in the paper I finally did complete about this mapping project, I ended up concluding that the maps are for show, after all, but not only for show. Instead, I think we can and ought to interpret them as the graphic artifacts of a particular style of political leadership, one that has evolved in China out of past governance achievements, lapses, and missteps, and in response to technical and social challenges presenting themselves on a scale now and at a level of complexity never imagined or grappled with before. They illustrate still very handsomely, in my eyes, what I see as a distinct style of leadership that has become one of the trademark characteristics of 21st century Chinese governing practice. Back to that. At the time that some of these thoughts were just beginning to gel in my mind, Patricia Thornton, once a student at Berkeley, now my valued colleague in Chinese politics at Oxford, Tia and I were just starting to plan for an international conference that we wanted to convene in Oxford in 2012, to which we gave the rather deliberately expansive title, Governing and Being Governed in 21st Century China. Our research aspirations for the conference were actually pretty modest ones, despite the title, though. Essentially, we wanted it to be exploratory, to provide a preliminary scan through the essays that would ultimately be published from the conference of what we were then, in 2012, perceiving as a puzzlingly irregular, expanding universe of changing Chinese political practices. The emphasis we put on practices. And we aimed to sample what we suspected or felt was becoming a broad, unevenly choreographed repertoire of governing practices. My own chapter would focus on mapping as a practice of power. Hers would concern new governing practices applied to managing the social management of the urban poor and the marginalized groups. Well, now that the collected papers after all these years have finally gone to press, we think our volume may actually have more to offer to our field than just a sampling. And so I want to leave the mapping dimension of governance now and turn for my remaining time more to outlining for you the general argument of the book as a whole. It'll be out in 2017. And we do hold out some hope that it may, if it's read, succeed in suggesting a refreshed general framework for approaching the study of governance in China today. A progressive orientation, we hope, at least, for some good future research by young people. As the political scientists here today among you will recall, by the dawn of this century, what we had called transitology, the transition to democracy paradigm, that kind of work, was already showing signs of having exhausted its usefulness. And a new generation of Western scholarship began probing what it posited to be the characteristics and the dynamics of those more obstinately not democratizing authoritarian regimes, of which there were plenty to be found around the globe. That emerging subfield of studies in comparative authoritarianism began turning up evidence that autocratic elites were indeed becoming adept at creating modern political institutions, such as parties and popular elections, that would actually serve to consolidate their hold on power and successfully foster more durable forms of authoritarian rule. And given the neo-institutional turn prevailing over much of the discipline then, many of these new scholarly studies set out to demonstrate that political institutions are, in fact, the critical causal variables in the survival of authoritarian regimes. This new orientation significantly impacted the China field too, and the mounting evidence presented by these scholars does seem to show that over the years, the CCP also has been learning how to rule more subtly and astutely than before. And yet, many of our close observers of China still predict that the reform authoritarian learning curve of the party state will not extend indefinitely. Sooner or later, authoritarian resilience must somehow be supplanted, they say, by genuinely liberal, more democratic political institutions in order to avert a future crisis and state collapse. There's an apparent contradiction here, we believe, and we believe that it can be traced to the tendency in the comparative authoritarianism literature to continue to be driven by a conspicuous intellectual yearning to explain what is felt still to be the incomplete, partial, and failed third wave of democratization. So in the introduction to the work, Tia and I argue that the very concepts of authoritarian adaptation and resilience, which have been imported into comparative governance studies from the ecological and the engineering sciences, these very concepts each carry core assumptions of their own that are problematic in modeling political affairs. Assertions of the resilience or the durability of a particular political system implicitly project assessments of that system's demonstrated capacity to weather previous crises and shocks into the future. But today's evolutionary biologists who are analyzing processes in the natural world have already learned the hard way to avoid predicting future trends and outcomes in the systems that they study. The most sophisticated contemporary advances in natural world evolutionary theory recognize that random variations within complex systems can, and very frequently do, set development along totally new and unpredictable paths, not all of which contribute to or ultimately result in overall system survival. Since complex nonlinear systems are constantly evolving, these scientists caution, lessons once learned in the past may no longer work or retain validity in the present. And the nature of systems and systems equilibria also can and do change, often quite unpredictably. In other words, we must accept that in both the natural world and the human one, behaviors and practices that appear merely adaptive may in fact be shifting the mainstream of change incrementally or even more rapidly into new and unanticipated directions. In that introductory chapter, we make an argument that current concepts of authoritarian resilience and adaptive change have genuinely been helpful in challenging the underlying implicit teleological assumptions of transitology. Nonetheless, researchers in our China Studies subfield must confront the fact that resilience as a working concept only takes us so far, and more critical imagination is urgently called for if we are to theorize persuasively about unanticipated evolutionary pathways. Our next step, then, in the China Studies field, we think, must be to seek new perspectives from which to apprehend what we see as a much broader panorama of multivalent practices and processes that are all simultaneously present, exerting influences and energies within the system and needing to be traced out as tributaries to the flow of China's swiftly ongoing political evolution. So what our collection has to offer, we now think, is a range of different vantage points on the problems of governing and being governed in China from a group of senior observers who have shared a working orientation toward the understanding of governance today as full of countervailing pressures moving in more than one direction at any one time, and so potentially full of paradox. An understanding of governing, that is, as a hybrid or an amalgam made up of rather widely differing purposes and praxes, something that's not all of a piece, a complex of shifting forces, and one most definitely with no single hand in control. I think I have on 3 slides here, I have the table of contents. If I had more time, and maybe we can do this in the Q&A if you're interested, I'll be able to tell you a little bit more about the chapters that are each of the chapters. But let me just sketch out for you here the general organization of what we do. The first 3 papers, as you see here, focus in the typical way. I'm afraid it's rather predictable, after all, the way we've organized it. There are many ways we might have organized these very rich essays. But this focuses, of course, on leadership practices, strategic practices at the very top level of the system. The next 2 papers move the spotlight down just a bit to the mid-reaches of bureaucratic action, where bureaucrats and people come into some kind of contact but not direct and somewhat intermediated or at arm's length contact, and how 2 ways of dealing with problems of politics at that level. The next section, as you see, brings us down to consider politics and governance carried out by agents of the state at local levels, and here we look primarily at urban and rural areas that are rapidly urbanizing right at the grassroots level. And the final 3 papers in the typical state society division drive the analysis that step further down into society, talking about governing through the manipulation of class and class identities, and also taking a Foucaultian turn in the end, looking at certain practices of governmentality, or what are called techniques of the self, in the final chapter. What we're saying is required with this collection of essays after we've evaluated it, Tia and I, is that we find an approach that's capable of accommodating the mixed effects multidirectionality that's observable within all these different ongoing processes of political change, an approach that's attuned to recognizing the internal strains of crisscrossed and intersecting trends within political systems. To get to this, we believe we need to generate first a new metaphor or a frame of analysis, one that's capable of capturing incremental factors and processes, including those that converge to form a mainstream of evolutionary change, along with those that may wander off into other channels, drawing strength away from the main. Striving for such a broader panorama of the processes that are contributing to political evolution over long periods of time. That's the kind of approach we hope to be advancing with our new publication. And we hope it may be followed through now by others with more detailed delineations beyond these few that we have scanned in our particular overview. Our initial expectation, as I said, was that we might conduct a first scan to help define a repertoire of diverse practices that were enmeshed in different dimensions of governing China today. But by the time we finally neared completion of the revisions and the re-editing, we actually started to wonder whether we didn't need to reconsider that initial expectation, whether our idea of scanning a repertoire of governing practices did or didn't, when all was said and done, stand up as the most appropriate frame or metaphor to use in characterizing the interesting but really tangled techniques we'd actually uncovered. This was because in all cases, the practices that are highlighted in these essays don't conform to fixed scripts. They are not static, but they are in themselves continually undergoing renewal and revision. They appear not polished or pre-rehearsed, but forever fluid and continuously in the making. Furthermore, the practices highlighted in the book are never performed singly. They overlap each other in time, inhabiting different spaces or dimensions, so to speak, of the larger overall process of governing, intersecting with one another at intervals, but with no one set of practices ever dominating all the action on the political stage. And the stage on which the performance of governing proceeds appears to us now more akin to that of a carnival or circus, with multiple rings and stalls and tents. There is not one single political stage at the front of a theater, suitably set and illuminated and designed to hold the spellbound gaze of the audience. It's rather more like a circus with many multiple rings and stalls and tents, all simultaneously offering what you might think of as popular attractions, games, and amusements. So these two important features of the governance practices that we uncovered with our work, their kinetic fluidity and the simultaneity of their performance, we thought, are perhaps not, after all, best captured conceptually as choices made from a preset menu or from pre-rehearsed theatrical repertoire. It was Charles Tilly, of course, who so influentially used the term repertoire to describe what he saw is a limited set of routines that are learned, shared, and acted out through a relatively deliberate process of choice. He understood the elements in a repertoire to be, and I'm quoting, learned cultural creations that emerge from struggle. And it's here, so it seems to us now anyway, that the conceptual framework of the repertoire reaches certain limits. And it doesn't fit the dynamically unfolding facts on the ground in China quite as well as we had foreseen. So, is there a more fluid metaphor? A better fitting heuristic we could adapt, we ask, for the conceptual task we face. A few very good comparative politics scholars lately have been urging that we take evolution more seriously in political science. And this injunction, along with the findings of our contributors, did stimulate us to turn our attention to some of the revisionist theorizing that's now taking shape in the fields of evolutionary ecology, including research in macroevolutionary processes. We've been curious to consider in particular some of the very latest inspiring work being done by paleoanthropologists of all people, investigating the evolutionary histories of primates, including early hominins such as Australopithecus and the emergence of the genus Homo. Propelled by advances in DNA analysis and by some extraordinary fossil finds made in recent years over different parts of the globe, these sciences have been going through an especially rich period of theoretical questioning and rethinking. With working assumptions, of course, rooted in the Darwinian model of evolution, scientists in these fields once, not long ago, sketched their images of evolutionary change, including their images of primate evolution, in a straight, linear, ever upwardly ascending design. A convention that was later replaced by a conception which came to be represented in the form of a branching tree and then a bush. But the branches on the trees and bushes, which represented differing species, and these branches and bushes were familiar to every schoolchild just a generation ago, these branches were imagined as discrete ones growing off and away from each other, never to interconnect again in space or time. With the lately mounting genetic and fossil evidence of early hominin population flows and intersections, even interbreedings across species, however, many of these scientists today have concluded that it is now time to replace the representation of a tree with that of an interwoven plexus of genetic lineages that branch out and fuse once again with the passage of time. A new impetus has been emerging then, lately, in evolutionary science circles in favor of substituting a more liquid, watery image, and specifically the image of a braided stream for the familiar but still stiff and twiggy tree. The braided stream looks now to be a leading candidate for representing some of these empirical researchers' freshest understandings of the processes they have uncovered through their research. Now, it's worth pausing to note that this concept of a braided stream wasn't invented by the paleoanthropologists, but borrowed by them from the science of physical geography as a metaphor to better capture the overall patterns of flow and change that they had been observing and struggling to describe. A quick primer on braided streams. Braided rivers frequently form when glacial ice melts. Water moves away from the source in fast-flowing streams and rivers, sometimes, depending on the nature of the underlying substrate, transporting great quantities of sediment and larger debris. If the sediment load is very large in relation to the velocity of the stream, coarser material may begin blocking the stream, diverting it, and forcing it, often repeatedly, to change its course. Such rivers consist of multiple smaller channels that divide and recombine, forming an intertwining pattern resembling a braid. A dynamic and fluid process model like this may also be usefully employed to express overall patterns encountered in political evolutions, we think. Such a fluid heuristic, postulating what is an ornate tracery of interlacing flows, traveling at differing speeds over uneven spaces and across time, could truly help guide future research in comparative politics as a supplement to some of our more familiar linear, tree-like, and performative or repertoire-like heuristics. In this kind of modeling, improvisation can count for as much or even more than pre-rehearsals. The model our collected essays suggest to us, anyway, for approaching the study of governance in Chinese context today, therefore, is that of a work always in progress, a work in perpetual, if uneven flow, sometimes interrupted, winding and backtracking around obstructions, sometimes even splitting or parting ways to head off in divergent directions from a single juncture. So, to govern China now, our collection of essays suggests is to meander, just as this talk has meandered, and I have meandered, lost in space much of the time. It is a multi-stranded process which privileges nimbleness, mutability, and an openness to institutional invention and procedural change, both proactive change and reactive change. Protean qualities such as these are not the ones that most of us would associate either with the functioning of routinized, elite-managed authoritarian political systems, or with the prevailing political rhythms that characterize, or are supposed to characterize, institutionalized, electoral, and rule of law-based democratic systems. Yet they seem to us now to capture well that condition of unceasing restlessness, which we see as so characteristic both of those who are striving to govern and of those being governed in China today. I will stop there. And Yo-Tien, turn the podium back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vivian, for this very wonderful, innovative talk. I have to admit that as a geographer, these maps and rivers look particularly close to my heart. Thank you. So our discussant today, Professor Kevin O'Brien. Again, another person really doesn't need lengthy introduction. Just a few words. Professor Kevin O'Brien is a professor of political science and director of Institute of East Asian Studies here on campus. He's also a very, very productive writer. Numerous pieces and books on China's legislative politics, local election, and popular protest and policy implementation. He has published several very influential books, including Reform Without Liberation, China's National People's Congress, and the Politics of Institutional Change, and also Rightful Resistance in Rural China. His most recent work centers on the Chinese state and the theories of popular contention. Without further ado, Kevin.
Like Vivian and Yo-Tien, I'm a fan of maps as well, going back at least as far as one of Vivian's colleagues at Yale when I was taking his classes from Ed Tufte on the visual display of quantitative information. I think the reason I know nothing about regression or quantitative analysis is because when I was doing the class with him, the only thing we ever heard about was data to ink ratio and things like that. But it was a wonderful time. It was when he was putting those books together that have become so influential since then. If any of you haven't seen a particularly good map that's related to water and land, there was one in the Sunday Times this week that showed water as Democratic ponds in the recent election and vast swaths of land as Republican strongholds. And the interesting thing about this map is that it was still very recognizable as a map of the United States when you just took out these very few Democratic strongholds and turned them into water. So it was quite striking and very much in the Tufte tradition. On to Vivian's talk. Like many of the best presentations, this is ultimately a talk more about questions than answers, in particular asking the right questions and at a certain level of analysis. And this is an issue that's become pressingly urgent, as in this last week in the study of American politics. But it's also something that we need to think about much more in the field of China studies, where many of us go our merry way gathering data, quantitative or qualitative, and don't think often enough about what all that data is about and whether it's what we truly should be focusing on. Someone like her other former Yale colleagues, Jim Scott's work on legibility and how states see the territorial and people they control, Vivian tells us we should be thinking more about planning in the first half of the talk. And it's still massive scope in contemporary China. She wants us to think about a wildly ambitious master plan that cleaves the country into zones and functions. And despite some admirable attention to balance in the plan, at least for me, there was some very worrying language about engineering-like notions of optimization and prioritization and restriction that show that top-down ways of thinking are very much alive in the minds of people not that many generations away from central planning and the whole nation as a chessboard. Anyone who's ever been to a Chinese village and seen the disarray often found there in how they're laid out can't be opposed to a little bit of zoning. But it's striking that the plan, at least in the parts I read, didn't sound like it was organic at all. It has a whiff of the hubris that has got planners into trouble in China and lots of other places over the years. Likewise, it's wonderful to hear about ecology as a pillar of planning, especially here in a country where climate change is now said to be a Chinese hoax by our president-elect, and climate change denier is busy staffing the EPA as we speak. But I still wonder a bit about the scientism and the best practice managerialism that underlies some of what's being proposed. It can't help but remind me of Silicon Valley techno-optimism and the data science will solve everything, and maybe even set us free ethos that's sweeping campuses like this today. And speaking along those lines, I was at a recent meeting of our research directors here, and somebody who was working on data science had actually come up with a map of campus and put X's on every building that was going to be influenced by data science. And there were precious few buildings that were not included in that map of it precisely this. So sure, it's good to have maps and plans to think about order, harmony, and comprehensiveness. And dreams and visions of the future are great and can play a role in agenda setting and pointing a way forward. But I'm not so sure that these maps will get all concerned parties on the same page, or that normatively we should hope that they will. I agree these maps are not just for show and are undoubtedly a leadership instrument. But I guess what gets me, after being a mid-level administrator here for a while, is just how wrong-headed most higher-ups are about most things, and how hard it is for them to believe that free energy and initiative can come from below as well as above. So I'm absolutely with Vivian that mapping and planning are leadership instruments. But I'm also taking, I guess this is more of a normative comment, about how they can be wrong-headed exercises in so many ways. Now, Vivian may well agree with this, and I haven't had a chance to read the chapter in the forthcoming book that likely deals with these issues. So I don't put this forward as a critique, just as a friendly amendment or an observation or reaction. As for the second part of Vivian's talk, evolutionary biology has been seductive to political scientists for a long time, at least since when I was in graduate school reading Stephen Krasner on sovereignty. And it's been seductive in both its Dawkins, highly functional variety, or the Stephen Jay Gould way of thinking about randomness and making the best a species can make of what it started with. Now, that's been floating around for 30 or 40 years. I, too, am concerned with the functionalism of much recent work on China that threatens to become, as structural functionalists were long critiqued for doing, presenting a complacent commentary on the status quo. I agree politics and the future are much messier than that, and that teleology is a real peril, and the unanticipated is so often where the action is. I'll point to last Tuesday again for that. But theorizing about the unanticipated and indeterminate is no easy job. Much like Niels Bohr said about prediction, that predicting is difficult, especially about the future. Where do you start? Vivian says rivers and their tributaries coming in and out. It's a nice image. I like it. But I think there's some inherent issues in it too, which I'll be curious to see how the chapters in the volume address. How can we tell what's the mainstream in that picture? And which tributaries are coming in and strengthening, or going out and weakening? I always think that historians have such an advantage over political scientists because they know what comes next. We don't. The simultaneity she mentions, which seems just right, makes this task even harder. So someone like me who works on protest and repression, is this part of the mainstream, or is it a tributary wandering off to no end? Right now, I can't tell. And even before I read this paper, this is something I've wondered about for a long time and don't know how to begin to resolve in real time. So instead, I just go on studying my flow and hope it's part of the mainstream, or at least a tributary flowing in. But I'm perfectly ready in the long run to learn it was a stream flowing out that dried up and didn't amount to much of anything. But the usual river image, at least in my single-minded way of thinking of hydrology, has its limits, and this is what Vivian is telling us about. As she points out, contemporary evolutionary thinking looks at lines that branch out and then refuse once again with the passage of time. Like glacial flows, the tributaries may wander off and then come back. So protest and repression in China, my example, may divert energy and become less important, and then add energy and become more important at a later date. Or maybe a number of small streams will work their way down off the glacier, vaguely alongside themselves. Meandering sounds right to me and cuts against the planning images brought up in the first part of the talk. But one of the questions I'm left with is there still a mainstream? Or many indeterminate large and small streams flowing downwards? Either seems perfectly possible. But I still think for theorizing, sorting out the mainstream comes in and what it comes to be is something that we need to be thinking about. And otherwise, I'm a little afraid that when we look at an image like this, or at least somebody like me looks at an image like this, and I'm tempted to throw up my hands and just say, it's complicated, it's indeterminate, it's multivalent, it's beyond my ability to comprehend. But I may be getting a little off track here. I've been assuming the meandering was what we were trying to understand. But then by the end of the presentation, the meandering seems to characterize how governing takes place. And I'm not sure which one of these Vivian is talking about. Now, Mao once criticized exams as a surprise attack. Like teachers, discussants have one advantage. We get to launch surprise attacks. For the first time in my entire career, I've thrown away that advantage. And I sent Vivian my comments beforehand. So she had ample time to shred them and convince all of you how misguided they are. So I'll stop right here and see if she wants to put me back in my place like I was in a seminar 35 years ago.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. I want to say a profound thank you for having the grace to send me these comments ahead of time and to be that organized in the middle of everything that's going on, to get me some written comments. And I promise to be quite brief. And I thank you for the comments themselves. First of all, thank you for pointing out that I do think that we should be thinking a whole lot more about planning when we think about how China works. I so much think that I forget to mention it sometimes. And yes, I think that's still an extremely important dimension of governance, though we talk much less about it now than we used to. But Kevin says he's worried by some of the language, engineering-like notions of optimization, prioritization, restriction. Yes, indeed. These are top-down ways of thinking, all right. I chose those words because I hoped to trigger that kind of worry in your minds. But I think I would just say, I do mean us to recognize this for what it is. We've seen this before many times, and we should be very appropriately suspicious of it and where it may lead and the ways in which it may fail. I would just say here that I think this has more in common with World Bank think and Asian Development Bank urban modern Asian futures, urban planning thinking than it does with the whole country as a single chessboard, or anything resembling the old state socialist balance planning. That's where most of these ideals and that managerialism and best practice are more derived from, I think. Kevin says he's not so sure that they will succeed through their maps of getting all concerned parties on the same page. Of course they won't. And there are reports that are coming out now, quite good ones, I think, from Chinese sources that tell us about the struggles. Everything from poaching to local officials breaking the rules and making agreements to allow tourists into their restricted areas and so on, and numbers that these areas can't sustain. It goes on in the national parks. Of course they won't succeed in getting everyone. I think they know they won't. What I wanted to draw attention to simply is how important it still is to them to try hard to get all people on the same page, all concerned parties on the same page. We don't see that in a great many other political systems, and it remains a hallmark of the way in which the Chinese Communist Party still wants to lead. Theorizing about the unanticipated and the indeterminate is no easy job, Kevin says. Yes, indeed. And that's why I do think if we accept that the future is indeterminate and unpredictable, then I do think that we need to be thinking much more in our social sciences about what tools and which data we would need to be able to attempt to think in this way about the future and what is unanticipated. What would we have to have? This scan done in these chapters tells us about lots of different domains of politics and political practice. And what would it take to do not just a scan, not just an introduction, but a serious analysis over this broad a panorama. That's what I hope the book might trigger serious students to consider. I'm not sure, Kevin, how to answer your question about the mainstream and what is or isn't in it. Because I see that as something, I can cheat actually. I had one more. I had one more slide that I didn't use. What
That's not a bad answer.
Yeah, what this slide shows, I think, is that our rivers can travel, our braided rivers can travel quite a long distance, never coming together into a mainstream. And I mean, I think what that
But
cautions.
there is a main direction too.
Yes, there is. It's down. And these rivers do end in lakes or they end in seas. That they share in common, but how they do it is very different. Some of them fan out into enormous muddy deltas. Others of them pour in pretty directly in the kind of stream you like, all one, all one. And that is what happens in nature. What happens in human life, we don't know. I see this as something we have to be prepared to watch as it changes, and probably for quite a long period of time. And this question about what's the mainstream and what's going to end up in it and what's going to end up being, lost, dry up somewhere and go into the atmosphere as steam. I think it stems from our natural yearning to be able to predict outcomes. But the imperative to predict is, in my own view, greatly overemphasized in the modern political studies. The braided river metaphor, anyway, is not one to help us predict outcomes, nor is it designed to be. It's a metaphor only. It's a metaphor only. It's not a model. It's one that's, I think, may aid and inspire us when we are modeling the tangled processes that contribute to political change. That these processes may occur in sequence, or they may converge in specific settings over long periods of time. It's a metaphor intended to help us conceptualize political change as an assemblage or an interacting set of social energies, as opposed to a single pathway toward the future. It's a metaphor that would help us. Another one might be blended instrumental ensemble music rather than a solo or a duet. And from the kitchen, another metaphor might be political change is a ragu. It's not a lamb chop. Okay? That's. Is it for me to stand here now and take questions? Okay. Do I call? Yes, Lynn.
This is wonderful. It's really wonderful research. I wonder, to what extent is the braided river normative or just realistic? One can actually often see, for example, in this slide, some of the streams. I can draw it there, which are larger than others. There is no single mainstream, but your thinking is like that of many others that have tried to deal with difficult to predict kinds of situations. In the China field, of course, there are relations to Jim Scott, but also Scott Boorman and his, I don't know whether you've tried to bring this in, but his interest in Mao Zedong's Wei Qi interpretation of revolutionary strategy for an end, for a consequence that Mao wanted. But there's very little in social science that is like what you're calling for, and that's why what you're doing is so interesting. The chapters are organized by sizes of collectivity, essentially, I think. I mean, center middle size and more individual, but also to some extent by time, and also to some extent by functions to the in a general meaning, not relating that too tightly to systems theory. But what some of the things you're dealing with are very similar to what I've read in chaos theory, in which, and you referred to this explicitly, I think, initial changes in some differences in some variables will affect later results differently, maybe at different later times, very importantly. And that's my question. Which aspects of China should we be most looking at for differences that become consequential in that way?
That, I think, is, what I hope that the future researchers will be inclined to ask and investigate. To take the example that Kevin raised, for example, of protest and repression of protest, I think there's very little doubt in my mind that that's a realm of politics we can count on being quite important. It may be more important at certain times than others, obviously it is. But it's a realm, a domain of political expression and governance that is going to be a factor in almost any political system, whether it's authoritarian or it's democratic, or it's somewhere in between. And that is something that Jim Scott has told us. There is always dissent. There is always a hidden transcript, even if it's quite suffocated at times. It is there, and it has its impact. But the ways in which it works can often be long in coming and uneven in their coming. And I think that's the only answer I can give. I mean, that I suppose I am asking people to be more patient in their expectations of the pace of change. It always seems to me, and political scientists are most guilty of this, they expect so much to change in a very quick period of time. And of course, sometimes it can. I mean, this is during a dry season, right? During the spring flood, this whole valley here is going to be one big mainstream, but that doesn't last forever, right? And you can almost argue that what's left now in the dry period shows us some of the deeper underlying channels that have been carved in the past and will still be there, influencing the currents of the water underneath in the future. And with that kind of approach in the back of our minds, as I said, this is not a model that's going to produce a conclusion about anything. It is only a habit of thinking about how change occurs that it seems to me could be refreshing. And I hope that some students may take this and think about, well, which are the domains that are important? I think I know some. Let me try to analyze and investigate their components and how practice occurs in those domains right now, and do the kind of work, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, that will elucidate that question and fill in the blanks for us. Let's see. Yes, I saw a hand here. Sorry, I don't.
Thank you for a great presentation. I really liked all of it. My question is about the very first part, and that is, it does look like a very top-down type of approach in terms of the overall plan. How much feedback has there been from local levels? How much buy-in? How much pushback? How much of all of this is aware? People are aware of this at the local levels. Are they in favor of it? In terms of your own awareness of say, local level responses, are people generally aware of it? Are they in favor of it? Or is it just another project by the suits from Beijing?
Yeah. one of the ways that we could approach answering that question, and it's a very interesting question that is going to have to be tracked over a long period of time, because this is a long-term spatial plan. It's going to take decades to work its way through, and these have been the first very rough years, I think. But if we look after the national master plan came out, then the next step was for every province to make its own master plan in accordance with the national zones that are in those maps. And I think if we look at the provinces which have been able to develop their own master plans in this interim since 2011 to the present, and have gotten them approved by the NDRC and the State Council, we can see two kinds of provinces. The first are the ones like Guangdong province, where development was slated to be optimized and go ahead full steam. And it must have been easy in that province, relatively easy, to fall in line with what was being asked for. And in those provinces where things are going to be good and it's all going to be high tech and optimized and modern, I think we get a quick ascent, at least from the provincial level. It still has to be fought all the way down. So the consequences of these zones, these maps, have to be worked out so that at the bottom, any place that is planned literally will have to be fit the zoning block by block, right, in new towns. So we've still got a very long way to go, even in those places. The other category, I think, I'm still trying to add up the evidence on this, but the other category of province where acquiescence was relatively easy, surprisingly enough, is those areas with some of the most fragile ecosystems, where I think the most research was already carried out and the conservation efforts are really comprehended by by provincial officials to be really, really important to do for their province over the long run. And so some of those like Heilongjiang, where there are vast forests that are just not to be developed and so on, they've been approved. In the middle, where restrictions and other prohibitions in small regions are under consideration, the evidence is very much as you would suspect, that this takes a long process of negotiation. Yang Wei-min said at that meeting that I went to, and it's in my chapter, but I didn't get to put it in this talk. He was asked by some of the student bureaucrats in the audience, so, aren't they going to just, down at local levels, they're going to just not go along with this, they resist, of course, and what are you going to give them? And he said, oh, no, they're not. They may try to resist, but in the end, they're going to have to agree because this is going to be the law. It is the law, and they will have to obey. Oh, of course, we'll need to negotiate, he said. We'll have to drink a lot of liquor with them in order to come to an agreement, even if a somewhat fuzzy one. And he estimated it would take the whole of the first 5-year plan just to drink all that liquor and get through the first negotiations, right? And they hemmed and hawed. The students weren't completely mollified. They said, well, you may get agreements, but they may still go back on them later on. They'll find ways around, and they'll be able to infringe upon these important areas, ecologically protected areas. And he said, oh, no, they won't, because satellite observations will reveal anything that's happening that shouldn't be happening, which was slightly exaggerated, I think, about what could happen. But I think we can be sure that there is all kinds of transgression and all kinds of stalling, and that's why so much money is going into this. That's why the central government is dishing so much cash into these regions. That isn't to say that isn't often a big waste, too. So it bears tremendous watching, and it is something that we do need to be highly suspicious of in a way, but also it's hard not to wish them a certain amount of success. I don't feel, I don't take a normative position on this, could I say? I mean, I do think these are the good men in Beijing, you know, in the Indians' terms, they think of themselves as good men who've had a good dream of a heavenly future, and they've worked hard on their truth, and it is in some way a truth. And they may get to the dream kill through another pathway, if they get there at all. But that's what we're looking at. We're looking at people who are trying to lead in the right direction with only, after all, computer projections and models to depend on. But that's their truth for the moment. Yeah. Other questions? Do I see any other hands? Yes, Mark.
Thanks very much, Vivian. I love this approach of combining ecology and geography, and I think it because I think it speaks to the heart of the contemporary crisis, which means that that the Chinese have to, and we analyzing them have to reconceptualize the whole foundations of development in a period in which development also means death by asphyxiation and destroying the land and destroying the water and so forth. But I want to come to the issues that you're now discussing, that Kevin's raising and you're responding to here, and that really is politics, which somehow is in the talk itself is in the background, but I think has to be brought to the fore. And it is this question. So you have a grand and glorious vision, top-down vision, comprehensive. It feels like socialism, even though China may best be understood as something like state capitalism at the present time. So the question is, how do you, in fact, take this pure, gorgeous vision and implement it in ways that not only make it work, but also work to serve people? And I'm thinking of what we've been writing about in the Asia Pacific Journal. We took the coal issue, and we have an analyst who studied China's coal policy, and he reads their documents very literally, and he comes up with the conclusion that China now has the plan to cut back on coal use, to stop being number one in the world in greenhouse gases, to move toward green energy and so forth. And he writes beautifully, and it's very persuasive, and so on. But what happens when we get down to the provincial level, and we get down to the local level, and we get down to the mines, where that means, well, it's exactly the American political issue now too. Do you close the coal mines, or do you roar straight ahead to maximize energy production, as we now seem in the Trump administration ready to do, in the face of Paris, in the face of green, and so forth. So I hear you when you say you have a kind of agnostic view. You're not taking a position on whether this is going to work, and even whether it's going to be worthwhile plans. But don't we have to, in fact, especially political scientists, whether they're scientists or not, engage the political forces that are going to run extremely counter? So this is the same question that the students were asking your guy, I suppose.
Yes, of course. Yeah, all our lives we've known about this. That at the top, these visions are announced in grand terms, and then all the way down the line, the politics seeks to undercut, and they have to try again and keep coming back to issues. I mean, that's why they prepared all of these policies areas, in order to try to deal with what they knew would be the inevitable opposition. If I were laying odds, given what I know of Chinese politics, I would expect that progress on this will be slow and halting and easily reversible. along the way. So by giving voice in this talk of mine about the maps to the way the maps are conceived and what their purposes are thought of in Beijing, I see myself as only giving voice or only elucidating a governing style. It's a style of governance that the Chinese still engage in. It has been updated and modernized and high-teched and glossed over with a lot of state capitalist rhetoric, yes. But we've seen this before, and we can expect that we will see the same kinds of local politics act itself out in only slightly different ways all the way up and down the system. So you may not hold out tremendous hope for the green outcomes involved here. And you may say, you can be sure one thing that's going to happen is a great many people are going to be uprooted from their homes and shipped out of areas where they've been living because they're declared to be excess population and resettled in other areas of the country. And these will be very damaging and hurtful exercises, right? So you can already easily imagine, I think, all the ways in which this will be likely to fail and be only partial in what it achieves if it is maintainable over the next until 2050 or so. Other governments, future governments, might back away from it. We don't know. This is a metaphor. It is meant to help us not think about what's going to happen about environmental protection in China per se. That is one of the rivulets, right? That is one of the tributaries. That sphere of politics, coal politics, is one of the domains of politics. Fossil fuel politics generally in China is one of the domains of politics that clearly needs to be unpacked. And if we're to understand the future, any students out there looking for a good project, obviously that's a good one. And I think it can be fitted into this kind of metaphor, but this is only to help you locate and think about the positioning of those different sectors of politics that we need to study with the same old methods that we've always used, I think, and with expectations of some of the same old outcomes. Yes. Yu Tian. Oh, sorry. We've got. Yeah. Angel, you're in charge. Okay.
Sorry about that. I just had 2 quick questions about the map data itself. The map data that you were looking at, the zones, really.
Yeah.
How did they deal with areas of contention, really, like near Japan or in the South China Sea or Taiwan? And was there anything about the data that particularly shocked you?
The data.
Yeah.
Okay, I haven't examined the GIS data or anything like that. What shocked me? Many things shocked me, and in the chapter I talk about the maps themselves as creations. It's as maybe did you see? I don't know whether it's worth backing up to some of them, but they are confined to the national landed territory, all of them, and you can see that Japan doesn't appear. No neighboring countries appear, and they are as if there is actually very little in the way of connection. China appears as an isolate here, and it is only these sort of gentle hues that distinguish different regions, that even hint at the fact that the Earth is not flat here, and that this is not an all of a piece entity, right? And only a few, and this map you'll see only Beijing is starred, really, right? Very few other places appear, and so this is national planning on a kind of tabula rasa almost in a way.
Isn't
Right?
it striking that China is the land and it doesn't include the waters?
Yeah.
It doesn't include the sea, which in fact
is the question. And in 2013, yeah, I was coming to that. In 2013, I think it was, the go-ahead was given for carrying out this exercise of zoning on all of China's territorial waters as well. It is still in planning. I haven't seen it. I don't know how many people have seen it, and I don't know how far it extends, but I have an idea how far it extends. Yes. So we have to wait. We have to wait to find out. Yujian. Wenxin.
So this is really an exquisite talk, and it's fascinating. I find myself still trying to come to a better grasp of what you have in mind. But all in all, I think the one word, as a historian, that is the one word that captures my attention the most is this word continuous evolution. Or you've given us a map, and you've given us a lecture about mapping, and you've shown us dynamics, power dynamics across space. That it's contiguous, it's connected, it's contingent, and they converge. But in what way do they constitute this concept, or do they relate to this concept of continuous, for the continuous or continuity with a trajectory in time appears to be the one thing that you are actually seeking to reject, or at least to destabilize. That is to have this whole concept broken down into smaller units of analysis. Right. So in some ways, my question is actually comparable or resonates with Lynn's question earlier on. My question is simply that how does one account for the happening, which is taking place across this map. If continuity, when it comes to consolidation of power, concentration of power, or trajectory of things over time, if that is not to be a key player, if those factors are not going to be key players or critical factors helping to account for the happening, then how do we go about thinking about the happening? I suppose, this is a convoluted question, but in some ways it's a historian's question to a presentation which says a lot about space. But I'm also interested in the question of continuity in time.
Okay. That might be one way to interpret the word continuous, all right. I didn't think of that. What I had in mind was a somewhat self-indulgent memory of, does anybody remember continuous revolution? Still? Remember that idea? That idea of continuous revolution, which, by the way, was something that was taught to me here at Berkeley by someone named John Bryan Starr, who was on faculty many a year ago, who analyzed that concept. And that was very important during the Cultural Revolution. For those of you who don't know it, particularly traces its roots to Trotsky and a certain branch of socialist thinking about pushing the revolution ever forward. That I changed it to continuous evolution, and I really only had in mind not continuity with the past, though you're very right, Wenxin, that I want to emphasize that this occurs over this process that we need to grasp occurs over very long periods of time. And some of those channels have been dug into the substrate by previous events. You can consider them, if you like a more structuralist language, as continuing to structure or carrying on into the future events that occurred in the past and left their mark. So there is continuity in this image as well. But I think what I was stressing was more that this is a continuous process of change and remaking as well. It mixes both, perhaps. As I should say, history does, right? I think so. Who am I? Yo-Tien?
Okay, yeah. Vivian, this I assume is one national plan that you picked to focus on. And because we know there are also several other major national plans, notably the one done by the Ministry of Construction, 建设部, and they did all these national urban development plans. And there is another important one by the Ministry of Resource and Environment, 环境资源部, Environment and Resource. And they do the all land use planning every year. And they do land use quota, from the top to the bottom. And there is another one done by the Ministry of Forestry, mapping out entire nation's natural resources and also, most importantly, natural disaster zones, the areas that needs to be focused on. I wondered, if there is a mainstream, tributary question, what happened when there are many mainstreams? And what happened when when we talk about performance, there are many performers, competing with one another, doing their own version and envisioning of a national development plan. How do we count on, sort of take that into our analysis?
Yeah, this is something that I haven't studied, but it is very important. My guess about what happens with those plannings, since they are all official and they are all approved at very high levels, is that there has to be a congruence at every step of the way. So the plan that the environment industry and the plan that the urbanization, the construction and the new urbanization plan, all of that has to be in sync with his general overall master plan. This is my understanding of this. So when it comes to land, and soon when it comes to water, what can happen has to be congruent with this plan, which has now been enacted by the NPC. So it is the law of the land. And it's been backed up by a new environmental protection law in the interim also, which is part of the project. So the goal will be to get all of these official national projections to be congruent one with the other. Again, we can expect this not to happen in perfection. It may be very far from perfection. What fascinates me is the intent to make that happen. And this may speak to Wen-Xin's point also, that what is the happening? The happening is an interaction between the envisioning and the enforcement and the forced coordination that is attempted at the center with the reality of all of that substrate that's out there, which is in the way and which, in its own way also conditions the reality that finally occurs and that we see in the flowing of the process. What I'm saying to political scientists here is that if we can study some of those flows, just the flowing of the process, which is sort of like manageable for a dissertation or something like that, find a flow and look at it closely and see where you can make a contribution, and then see where it might fit in such a complicated imagining of the political change process, then for one thing, it would take the burden of a good deal of prediction off your back, and it would also, I think, help you steer away from hasty final answers to where we are or where we are going, which is something else that political science, not only in the China field, has been prone to. Yeah. So,
My turn?
are there more questions? Yes,
Yeah.
Joe. Okay, I keep jumping out of order.
So a question of a clarification. I think the way I understood your paper at first was that the maps that you're showing are slightly different from the maps of the logic of these maps is slightly different from the logic of a completely planned economy. Is that right? Because at some point you said they were influenced by the World Bank and the ADB.
Yes.
And then, but during question and answer, you said that the changes or the differences were only cosmetic, which then seemed to suggest that they were still part of the same old planned economy kind of thing.
No, I don't think I ever used the word cosmetic. What are you referring to exactly?
No. I mean, so if that's the case, then that these maps are significantly different, then it suggests a different model of power, which is what I think you're trying to suggest with all these flowy kinds of models. But the question that I had is, when I look at some of the terminology, especially in the third part of the book, the person that leaps out most to me is Foucault. The stuff about techniques of the self and so on. So how much of all of this and the suggestion that these are different approaches to take, how much of this falls under what Foucault called the governmentalization of the state? There's one thing is my chapter in the book, which is all about the maps, and that's mine. And that it was the first part of the lecture. The other thing is the book. And the book is not, and Kevin said he'd like to see how the other chapters address the model. They don't. So I hope you'll buy the book anyway, but they don't. The model came from the chapters. It came from our reading and thinking about what the chapters had to teach. So the chapters, including the ones on governmentality, there's really only one on governmentality, and that's the final one, which is about ways of governing the governors, you can say, ways of getting cadre officials to try to behave in accord with new expectations of excellent performance. And one of the ways to do that is to get them to internalize in themselves a tremendous will to improve and to innovate. And that's what that chapter is about. So it shows one tiny dimension of the governmentality domain of governing practices in China. The other two in that section are really not about what I would consider Foucaultian analysis at all. They really are about the manipulations of class categories and class identities and the reclassification of people in a period that is ongoing, where people are thought of and think of themselves to a degree in new categories of citizenry, and those are about governing people rather than governing communities or governing each other. So I'm not sure I quite understood your question, but the essays in this book were gathered as a first scan, as I said, and we thought we'd see what was out there. After we saw these fascinating studies of different domains of the processes of governing, then we thought, well, how do we characterize this? And was our idea of a repertoire really the best way to go? And if not, what's wrong with it? And why is it inadequate? And what can we do? What can we suggest to readers that they take away from reading all the essays in this book. That's the actual structure of it, of the argument. Yeah. And now, Joe.
I guess this is sort of becoming a two-part question, but first on the issue of maps and maps as a mode of governing. I mean, I'm mostly struck by how new this is. As someone who, from the first time I was doing research in local societies in China, was bringing my own maps to China. Local officials were saying, where the hell did you get that? And how did you know that village and something? And maps had always been regarded as such an object of security control. And now to actually be trying to govern by maps and making them public and then debating about them, it seems to me really something quite new in the 21st century. But the second question is, I'm having problems, as others have, with, I think, the meander metaphor, and especially the meander metaphor as a way of interpreting politics. The meander, whatever you do, the water is still going to flow down, and so it is going to go in a consistent direction. But my sense of, the way something like this is going to work in Chinese politics is the national government, after a certain amount of consultation, is going to come out with this wonderful national plan, and it's going to then take it down to the provinces and say, this is the zone for industry and agriculture, and the province say, well, we can't do that, and we can't do this, and we're going to fudge it this way and that way. And then you're going to take it down to the local level. The provincial people can take it on a local level, and they're going to say, no, we can't do this and that. We have to, and there's going to be resistance at each level of the hierarchy, but it's a hierarchical system in which the center is pushing a plan and local areas are resisting it in ways that you can't quite resist the flow of water downhill. There are some places where, no, we're not going to do agriculture here. We're going to do something else because we need the industry and we need the. So, I mean, how do you square this circle of the meander metaphor with a certain inevitable Kevin's mainstream going downhill?
Do you mean that?
And my sense of the way the politics is working and the resistance coming.
And your sense of the way the politics is working is that the pressure is coming from above. And did I understand you? And okay, the pressure is coming from above, and that is, the policy will flow downhill. The water, yeah, okay, yeah,
We're
no,
talking about authoritarian systems
no, I don't think the pressure definitely comes from above, but there is always resistance, as we know, as well as accident and all other kinds of limitations, and that is what determines the flow, right? I mean, the shape of the final process of getting to a political conclusion. In the downhill imagery of this, it is gravity that is time, okay? If you to move from water to politics, it's gravity that is drawing the water down to its destination. But we can conceive of that as change over time. So what I see in the interweaving or the interlacing of the flows within the river bed is the courses, the tortured courses, if you will, that need to be carved out in the process over time of getting to whatever the conclusion is. I am less concerned about predicting. I guess that's obvious, and so I am content to live with all sorts of contingency and unanswered questions. I find it quite the natural thing to do. I know that others cannot abide it, and so I'm not surprised. We try to solve the puzzles that we encounter, but my honest view is that this is what change looks like. And it proceeds through time in these twisting, interlaced ways. And that's what I'm saying. So the politics that you are asking about, the resistance, is, can you go with me that that's the substrate, that's what's down there, that the flow from the top is encountering, and as a result, it will be twisted and it will be bent and it will sometimes work and it will at other times dry up and go away and fail. And that the final outcome that we see in 2050 or 2060 or 2075, if we make it there, is that will be the result, the residuum of all of that flow and resistance, all of that politics that occurs on the floor of this river of change.
That elegant answer, I think, perhaps allows me to specify where my problem is. What is the political equivalent of gravity?
Time,
Okay.
time.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I think that's a wonderful last question and answer. I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you, Vivian, and thank you, Kevin, for wonderful correspondences and discussion. Thank you all. Thank you.
Great pleasure.